If there's one thing a dictatorship cannot bear to suffer, it is the voice of dissent. If this voice is amplified in an act of protest, best believe said dictator will come running to silence it. To a dictator, the voice is poison, a threat to the structure of power, a peril to the illusion of peace and order. Voices of dissent always need to be suppressed, crushed, eliminated. But that is the thing. Once words are released or acts of protests are witnessed, they can never be taken back. So crush and suppress all you want. Once a word is uttered and a deed is done, they can never be taken back. They echo throughout generations to come. One could try to damage control or brainwash or counter the voice with something louder and more impressive, but in the end, if the word takes hold and the seed is planted, dissent can be both viral and virulent. In today's episode, and in this second installment of the martial law series, I look into a case that starts with a simple food staple used the world over, an ingredient without which our desserts would be bland, our soy sauces too sharp, and our chocolates non-existent. I'm talking about sugar. If you thought sugar cannot be political, this case might just change your mind permanently. This is the case of the Escalante Massacre. Mabuhay LagimFam, welcome to another episode of Lagim, a Filipino true crime podcast. After having delayed this second installment of Lagim's martial law series, we are finally here at last. I first want to thank you all for your lovely messages and comments on my Instagram post where I'll let you know how I needed to take a bit of a break. The break is over now, obviously, and I'm feeling much better. I'm hoping to be more regular in my episode releases as well, so cross your fingers for me. As for today's case, I changed my mind a little bit about the cases I wanted to cover. I felt that with the rise in killings and forced disappearances of activists, farmers, and other dissenters of the current government, and with talks about a possible revival of the Philippine Sugar Corporation or Philsucor, a relic of the martial law era, in case you did not know, we need to look back at very recent history and hopefully see and understand that we have been here before, unfortunately. So without further ado, let us dive right in. And as always, please note that details in this case might be triggering to some people. So please take care of yourselves whilst listening. Today's case cannot be fully appreciated without a bit of a history lesson. So be ready for some true crime mixed with a brief history basics. The sugar industry in what we now call the Philippines predates that name and, of course, Hispanic colonization. It is said that sugar from the sugarcane came to our shores through Arab traders who brought with them cuttings of the tall perennial grass and then planted them somewhere in Mindanao approximately 200 years before colonization. As small pre-colonial sugar trades started budding in the south, sugar was then regularly shipped to the north to what we now know as Visayas and Luzon. So when the Spaniards invaded and colonized us, sugar farming was well established on many islands, including Visayas. I would not say there was an industry per se by then, but sugar has become a sought-after market commodity for sure, and the trade was thriving. Historians agree, however, that sugarcane farming only became a proper industry in the Philippines in the 19th century, when a British vice consul by the name of Nicholas Loney was sent to Iloilo City to convince American banking company Russell and Sturgis to open up a branch in Iloilo for the sole purpose of making loans available to sugar farmers. Loney did other things too. He essentially fast-tracked the Filipino sugar industry by importing sugar cuttings from Sumatra, getting machinery from Britain into Iloilo, which he then sold to sugar farmers who got their loans from Russell and Sturgis, just so they could upgrade their sugar farming processes. He then set his eyes on Negros and wanted to replicate what he had done in Iloilo there. As a consequence of a flourishing sugar industry in Negros, several sugarcane farmer families from Iloilo moved there, eventually amassing wealth from being able to export sugar to not only other parts of the archipelago, but also to other countries like the US, the UK, and Australia. At that point, sugar had become the most important agricultural export of the Philippines, from which Spain, of course, benefited profusely. After the Second World War, the sugar industry in the Philippines continued to flourish, and almost 20% of our country's income came from exporting sugar around the world. By then, the 70s hit, and this was when things started to shift dramatically. So what happened in the Philippines specifically? Well, the deciding year to remember here is 1974. It is as if many awful things came together to create a perfect sugar storm. In 1974, there was a huge increase in the price of sugar, and at one point, it peaked at 67 US cents per pound. But in the two succeeding years after this, the price suddenly fell to 10 US cents per pound. This was very bad news. Also in 1974, the so-called Lorry-Langley Agreement expired. Do not worry if you do not know anything about this trade agreement, because I initially did not know anything about it either. In a nutshell, this trade agreement ensured the preferential treatment of Filipino sugar within the US market. When it expired in 1974, the Philippines lost its quota for sugar exports and its access to the US market, its largest trading partner at that time. Now you might think, hold on Christine, aren't quotas a bad thing? They can be, but in this context, it was not. The US placed an export quota on the Philippines, compelling us to ship sugar to the US in huge amounts, thus ensuring a steady and stable income for everyone in the industry. So yes, we may have been restricted to trade with other countries at that time, but we had a steady cow to milk, so to speak. So when that privileged position from the Philippines was removed, the industry started to feel the consequences really quickly. Now bear in mind, this was all happening in martial law Philippines too. Now, just for context and just to give you some history spoilers here, the trade agreement was eventually renewed, but by that time, the terms were slightly different. By different, I mean the quota system was completely rewritten. The agreement essentially said that countries with the highest share in the sugar trade with the US between 1975 and 1981 would get the biggest sugar allocations in terms of export quotas. The Philippines was going through a tough time in these years, remember? So in the end, our country could not recover even with this new revised trade agreement. Keep that in mind for later. For now, let us jump back to the 70s. When things started going south for the sugar industry in the Philippines, dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr. and his economic advisors were convinced that the sugar crisis was solely to be blamed on pervasive market failure. In order to halt the crisis, the Marcos administration thought it would be best to stimulate the market development of the sugar industry by replacing the market with the government. By 1974, Marcos Sr. assigned sugar trading functions to Philex, or the Philippine Exchange Company, to rationalize sugar trade amid the rumors of cartels, according to one Rappler article. When Philex was abolished, the Marcos administration activated PhilSocom, or the Philippine Sugar Commission, in 1977. PhilSocom was endowed with the sole power to buy and sell sugar and then some. It was the entity that determined the prices being paid to sugar planters and millers. Furthermore, it was given power to purchase companies within the industry. The Marcos administration then attempted to protect the Philippine sugar industry from the world sugar price fluctuations by setting up a protective pricing policy. It entered into a 4-year-long contract to sell 50% of the exported sugar at an average price of $23.5 per pound. This was not an ideal solution because the world sugar prices were at around $30 per pound at that time. Eventually and horrifyingly, this led to a monopolization of the sugar industry. The trading subsidiary of Philsocom called Nasutra, which was short for the National Sugar Trading Corporation, was also battling controversies and accusations of cronyism. And as a result of all these things combined with the awful and oppressive political climate in the Philippines during the martial law era, the trust that the sugar farmers placed in their government was slowly but surely fading. It is against this backdrop that we zoom into one specific location in Negros Occidental, a town called Escalante, and fast forward to the 80s. Officially, martial law was lifted on the 17th of January 1981, but the writ of habeas corpus remained suspended. Given what I have just said about the sugar industry crisis in the Philippines that started in the second half of the 70s and the government's monopolization of said industry, the lifting of martial law provided little comfort to Filipinos, especially to Negrenses, who are at the precipice of something even worse. Enter the Negros famine of the mid-80s. Sugar producers gradually declared bankruptcy, and some even left their estates, leaving almost 200,000 workers and their dependents to fend for themselves. These workers tried to find other jobs in other industries, in other locations, but remember, the country was not doing well in general, so there were virtually no jobs to be had, or if there were, salaries were not great. The consequences were devastating. Reports from witnesses of the Negros famine, who are still alive today, detail how children started dying of hunger. One priest by the name of Father Armand Onion had to minister to grieving parents whose children lost their lives to severe hunger, malnutrition, and other related diseases like tuberculosis or pneumonia in the pediatric ward of the hospital that was located close to the church he belonged to. Later on, more recent administrations would admit that actually 1 in 5 Negrense children were drastically affected by malnutrition during the Negros famine. Soup kitchens that were run by local dioceses in Negros Occidental could not cope with the amount of people who came to eat just to survive the day. There was mass hunger in the country's sugar bowl, the irony of the century. Now, I already told you about the Marcos administration setting up all these different entities that were supposed to help the sugar industry in the country, and I also implied that these places were filled by Marcos cronies. Now, I'm telling you that they were completely run by cronies, just so we're clear. So it would come to no one's surprise at all that these cronies managed to run the industry to the ground, causing the unbelievable suffering of the Negrenses in the 1980s. At the center of the problem was a cabal of cronies named Jose Unson, Jaime Dacanay, and Fred Elizalde. They were all led by uber crony Roberto Benedicto, a former classmate and then of course crony of Marcos Sr. himself. Under the rule of these men, according to one sugar planter by the name of Fred Hilado, who told Rappler in an article they published recently, the industry lost around $1.15 billion between 1975 and 1984, and it was not lost trying to revive the industry in the Philippines. It was all lost to plunder under the Philsocom and Nasutra. So, whilst children with distended bellies, stick-thin legs and arms, protruding eyes, and anguished looks were dying and have died, and whilst a whole generation of children was lost to this government-caused famine, Roberto Benedicto amassed assets valued around 800 million back in 1983. Whilst a very small part of that plunder was eventually given back in some shape or form to the government, it was a little too late for the children whose futures will never be, and for the parents who had to live with grief, trauma, and continued misery of having gone through a crisis and famine that could have been avoided. Now, remember Father Onion? One day in 1985, he became the person who held a dying 7-year-old boy in his arms, who was later dubbed as Batang Negros. This child's name was actually Joel Abong. He actually died in the priest's arms, but a photo shot of him before his death was published on several magazine covers. And suddenly, Joel, this Batang Negros, became the face of what Rappler called a disaster spawned by greed, corruption, tyranny, and a long-entrenched system of injustice. Welcome to the Marcosian Golden Age. By 1985, the famine, or what one bishop called Tiempo Muerto, or time of death, had been going on for 5 years. In August of that same year, 10% of Negros' children were suffering from third-degree malnutrition. Meanwhile, the adults could not take it anymore. Anger festered while suffering continued. Seeing their children dying and seeing no steady or stable income flow into their households, the adults and others started to protest. The more they protested, the more the Marcosian forces tried to repress them. Sugar farmers who dared to march against the government mostly ended up dead in the fields they used to work on. Dissent was detested, and so were protests. By September 1985, the social volcano finally erupted. In September 1985, a 3-day strike that was organized by Welgang Bayan was due to take place in Escalante, Negros Occidental, and around the country. The protest was supposed to start on the 19th of September and end on the 21st, on the 13th anniversary of the declaration of martial law. Participants of the protests in Escalante were mostly so-called sacadas, or sugar cane workers, but they were also joined by fisherfolk, teachers, students, laborers, and citizens from all walks of life. The participants were ready to air out their grievances and make their voices heard. For them, it was clear that the suffering, the exploitation, and the violence needed to finally end. Now, the protesters were aware that Escalante was one of the most heavy militarized towns in the region. There was a regular army battalion, a company-sized regional special action force, police officers, and several hundred members of the CHDF, or Civilian Home Defense Forces, a paramilitary entity that was regularly deployed by the national and local governments until 1986 to maintain peace and order by mostly inflicting, well, a lot of violence. On top of all these people, a private army formed by the governor himself, Armando Gustillo, who was a Marcos crony and did a good job to quell any protest in bloody and violent ways, was also present in the region. Now, I cannot imagine the fear that was instilled in the Negrenses in that region at that time, going through a famine and all that suffering and ugliness that came with it, and having to be careful of all these military men who had the power and permission to kill you should you even dare to complain about your dying, malnourished children. Escalante was hell central. Now, despite the plan being that the protest should start on the 19th, activities already started taking place on the 18th when around 5,000 protesters in Escalante started staging a noise barrage. Both adults and children were joining in on the action, banging on empty pots and pans, condemning the starvation and poverty in their region. By evening, the crowd grew to around 10,000. That night, the protest culminated with a torch parade and a cultural show at the public plaza. In a weird moment of foreshadowing, a drunken soldier fired shots in the air, and although some people were scared and spooked, no one was actually hurt. And now, this brings us to the 19th of September. On the 19th of September, the protesters decided to form barricades, essentially creating a better designated place for the protesters to congregate in. At some point, the protesters formed the barricades in a way that would block passing vehicles in an effort to entice and encourage the drivers to join them in their protest. There were 2 barricades in total. The first one was by the town plaza outside a bank. This barricade faced the municipal hall. The second barricade was in front of the public market by a rotunda or roundabout. Remember, this was the first official day of protest, and as hoped by the protesters, they were able to make their voices heard without any type of incident. However, as the day went on, the protesters did notice how some fire trucks were slowly but surely arriving into town. But that was not the only thing that was arriving at this point. The protesters saw how the paramilitary forces, the CHDF, and other armed men were arriving into town as well. Bear in mind, this was not a complete surprise to the protesters at all. Sure, the protesters knew that government forces would be watching closely and not approving of their actions, but the protesters were bothered by something else in this case. A fortnight before the protest started, Radio Cadiz, a station owned by Marcos' crony, Governor Gustilo, made sure to launch a rather snide campaign against the incoming protests, calling Welgang Bayan a communist infiltrated group, amongst many other things. So the protesters in Escalante were aware that Gustilo was displeased anyway, but protests in this region normally started and finished peacefully, so surely it should not be any different this time around, right? Nevertheless, the protesters watched with trepidation as all these armed men marched into town, and their trepidation was very much justified. On the afternoon of September 20th, 1985, protesters in Escalante occupied the town's public plaza, which was located a mere 50 meters across the town hall where Governor Armando Gustilo held office. Protesters held up placards and bamboo sticks. They were shouting and chanting anti-government slogans. They were voicing out what everyone in the region had been wanting to say for ages, what everyone had been feeling in the past 5 years, full of suffering, darkness, and hopelessness. A lot of these protesters went into the second day of this 3-day strike having to reassure their loved ones that they were going to be okay. Word of the armed men from the day before started spreading around after all, and the fear was palpable amongst the loved ones of those who were protesting. As morning hours ticked by, the protesters noticed how more and more fire trucks started arriving into their town. They carried even more soldiers and other sorts of armed men. At some point, the organizers were informed that the leader of Welgang Bayan, Chairperson Rolando Ponsica, was arrested in his home, having been instructed by those arresting him to order the protesters to disperse from the town center. By noon, some more CHDF members arrived together with other armed individuals who started taking positions at different points at the town plaza. This looked planned and organized, the protesters must have thought. Very quickly, the protesters were tightly encircled by around 50 RSAF members, plus local policemen, members of the CHDF, and other armed civilians, potentially from Gustilo's private army goons. Witnesses from that time saw these men being in full gear, being fully armed with not only high-powered tear gas, but also tear gas canisters. Something wasn't right. Police officers then went around the town's shops and stalls asking their owners to close down for the day because, in their words, the protesters would be dispersed. The protest organizers then instructed their negotiators to be ready in case there was a need to perhaps communicate with the soldiers surrounding them. This is a direct quote from the Human Rights Violations Victims Memorial Commission's website as to what happened next. One policeman inside his vehicle invited the negotiators inside the municipal hall. The organizers, already aware something was amiss, insisted that the negotiations be done outside instead. The police left and did not return. Protesters also saw a machine gun perched on top of the municipal hall. When the wife of Edgardo Salili, an ASFIN member and one of the organizers, who had been in Escalante as early as September 17th, brought him food and saw the machine gun, she pleaded for him to come home, but to no avail. The threats of dispersal and danger were imminent, but the demonstrators still wanted to continue. To counter the tear gas, they prepared calamansi, collecting the juice in pails and wetting handkerchiefs. The frontliners started shouting, "Makibaka, wag matakot." and linking their arms. Across the plaza, Town Mayor Braulio Lumaino and then Governor Gustilo were seen leaving the town hall escorted by their bodyguards. And then, all hell broke loose. Mere minutes after the governor and mayor left, protesters at Barricade 1 were attacked by soldiers firing water cannons at them. Being doused by water did not stop the protesters, though. They refused to disperse. They refused to let go of their linked arms, even cracking jokes about finally being able to have a shower. When I read about this, I marveled at the Filipinos' ability to see the comedy in the most dire of situations, which is why the next moments on this day were all the more heartbreaking, because the water cannons were just the beginning. When the fire trucks that carried the water were all emptied out by the soldiers and other armed men, they resorted to tear gas. One badass protester by the name of Juvelin Harabelo saw a tear gas canister land near her, and without hesitation, she picked it up and threw it back to the soldiers. This singular act of defiance spelled doom for young Juvelin. The soldiers honed in on her, and then a sudden gunfire erupted. The soldiers and armed men shot and fired at her multiple times, killing her right then and there. Pretty quickly, the shooting was not just aimed at Juvelin anymore or the other protesters near her. Bullets from machine guns and other armed weapons flew around the plaza, seemingly indiscriminately, but the violence was very much on purpose and purposefully unrestrained. The brutality was devastating. Protesters from Barricade 1 started running away from the armed men to shield themselves from the rain of bullets that seemed unending. But some protesters were so quickly ravaged by bullets that they never stood a chance, dying on the spot. Now, remember that the protesters at Barricade 2 could not completely see or hear what was going on at Barricade 1. There was a distance between them. They heard the shots, but they were too far to recognize that something awful had already gone down. They thought they were just hearing some warning shots. After all, the protesters at Barricade 2 were too busy standing firm whilst being doused with water from water cannons on the fire trucks that were parked near them. They continued to link arms in protest. But then they saw their fellow protesters from Barricade 1 running in all directions. Upon closer look, it looked to the Barricade 2 protesters that their fellow protesters from Barricade 1 were wounded and bloodied. So, what to do? Here's another excerpt from the Human Rights Violations Victims Memorial Commission's website as to what happened next. Quote, "They continued protesting until they saw people running, some of them wounded and bloodied. They had been eager not to disperse, but mass panic ensued. Many of the surviving protesters fled or hid. Those who remained to face the attackers saw some of the onlookers and their relatives picking up rocks and preparing to throw them at the soldiers. One of the protesters shouted at the soldiers that they were surrendering, but the armed troopers of the CHDF kept their guns aimed at the hapless rallyists. They were given respite when a PC commanding officer recognized his nephew among the crowd and ordered a ceasefire, upon which they ran inside a church convent." End of quote. Across the plaza and near Barricade 2, instead of protesters chanting or perhaps screaming demands and anti-government slogans, moans were heard from the streets that were now littered with blood, bullets, and bodies. What truly horrified me, though, was to learn that the CHDF members who were on site proceeded to walk around and shoot some of the protesters who were already suffering and wounded on the ground. And then the shooting stopped. The surviving protesters looked for help so that the injured could be treated. All in all, the shooting claimed the lives of 20 individuals, bodies that were sprawled not only on the grounds of the plaza, but also in nearby sugarcane fields. Another 24 people lay wounded all over the place, whilst 197 people went missing. It was a bloody and gory scene, with nearby buildings now bearing the bullet holes from this awful and violent display of tyranny and repression. The dead were then placed side by side right in front of the town hall and were later picked up by the 334th PC Company. A doctor who tried to help the injured protesters remarked later how many of the dead protesters were shot in the back or when lying down, meaning that the perpetrators of this atrocity were shooting at people who were trying to flee or lying defenseless on the ground. This would become important much later when the armed faction in this case attempted to cast doubt on the stories of those who witnessed the brutality inflicted on the protesters or were injured themselves. In an attempt to further demonize and scare the protesters and the rest of Escalante, 21 protesters were also charged with inciting sedition. Many of those who were charged or were about to be charged managed to flee the area in the hope to escape police brutality and becoming a victim of a very corrupt justice system. And then came the damage control from the higher-ups. Then Lieutenant General Fidel V. Ramos was one of the more prominent commenters on what happened in Escalante. According to him, the armed faction in this case only fired in self-defense. This was said seemingly unequivocally. Remember, at this point, no investigation had been conducted yet, but you are probably not surprised that someone from the government like Ramos would immediately bark the loudest to drown out the voices of the witnesses who knew exactly what took place in Escalante. The town of Escalante was initially fearful, apprehensive to start life again in the wake of the massacre, but slowly but surely, rage and anger grew within those who either survived the shootings or those who lost someone to it. These fellow Filipinos decided to then let their voices of protest be heard. Now, the military was working hard to turn the narrative as demonstrated by Ramos already. The police, on the other hand, started to do their part in the cover-up by arresting organizers of the Escalante protests. Eventually, Wagang Bayan decided to fight back through official channels and filed charges against the Marcos administration for genocide before the UNCHR, or the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. There were court hearings, fact-finding missions, interviews. The goal was to win and get reparations, but if that were not possible, the victims in this case wanted at the very least to be recognized as such by the Marcos government. This battle lasted for years, and in the end, by 2011, the claimants were told that they were eligible to finally receive a settlement fund of $1,000 or 50,000 pesos from the Marcos estate. They received letters that said as much, and they kept those letters to later stake a claim from the HRVCB, or the Human Rights Victims Claims Board, who was empowered to recognize victims of human rights atrocities and to provide them with compensation for atrocities during the martial law era. So, sure, many of the victims of Escam, or the Escalante Massacre, were given monetary compensation, but what of the perpetrators? Well, the late dictator Marcos Sr. was eventually ousted during the 1986 People Power Revolution, as we all know, but zooming in on Escalante specifically, we now know that a total of only 45 individuals were charged in the massacre. This included Governor Gustilo, which provided me with a bit of comfort in this deeply disturbing story. Of the 45 people charged, only 28 were arrested, so 16 are still at large and or dead. Gustilo's case could never be pursued specifically. He was able to flee to the US, where he died in 1986. What little comfort I had when I learned that he was charged quickly dissipated, of course. Now, the whole case takes an even more infuriating turn, so I will try to go through the highlights of it really quickly for you. In a Supreme Court ruling from 1996, when Fidel V. Ramos was president, we learned that 28 individuals were tried, but only 3 lowly police officers were convicted and jailed for the Escalante Massacre. I'm not sure how long their sentences were supposed to be, but these 3 officers were eventually released in 2003. As for the 25 who were not found guilty, the court simply said that the evidence against them was insufficient. But this next one is what really upset me when I was reading about the case's odyssey through the courts over the years. One ranking member of the RSAF, so Special Action Forces, who was deemed as one of the main perpetrators of the massacre, was given the chance to be redeployed and even promoted at a later date. Somehow I'm surprised, but not really. Rewarding bad and even criminal behavior was and remains a norm in some places within the very establishments we are supposed to have a say on, amongst people we voted in to do what is in our best interest. So, what is the epilogue of the Escalante Massacre, one of the last and bloodiest martial law atrocities? Negros Occidental may have recovered over time from the 5-year famine and period of starvation, but all in all, the systemic problems persist. In that sense, Negros and Escalante specifically could not quite recover. The sugar farmers and their descendants are nowhere near the level of prosperity that the industry experienced before the 70s. Old sugar families still have the region in a feudal chokehold. Poor sugar farmers still suffer the most in this equation, and paramilitary forces still walk through towns to do quote-unquote surveillance and peacekeeping, as the Human Rights Violations Victims Memorial Commission's website would put it. Perhaps in a cruel twist of fate, the Human Rights Violations Victims Memorial Commission's website reports that Toto Patigas, a massacre survivor, was killed in a riding in tandem crime back in 2019. He would become the 48th Negros human rights advocate murdered since 2016. So, there may not be a rain of bullets on groups of protesters. There may not be any water cannons anywhere or a dictator in Malacanang anymore. There may not be placards, bamboo sticks, and other government chants in Negros anymore. But those who dare to speak against the system, those who dare to point out suffering of the poor and marginalized, those who point out the corruption in the government, are never safe. With every decision to open their mouths, they risk their lives, but if they do not speak up, if we do not speak up when faced with injustice, it will only be a matter of time until we see another tiempo muerto. William Alegre, 18 years old. Michael Dayanan, 17 years old. Rodney De Miguelio, 27 years old. Robina Franco, 14 years old. Juvelin Harabello, 20 years old. Alex Labatos, 18 years old. Angelina Lape, 17 years old. Norberto Locanilao, 16 years old. Rodolfo Mahinay, 23 years old. Rogelio Megalian Jr., 21 years old. Claro Monares, 29 years old. Maria Luz Mondejar, 16 years old. Rodolfo Monte Alto, 21 years old. Aniano Ornopia, 41 years old. Nanita Orot, 20 years old. Edgardo Salili, 24 years old. Ronilo Santa Ana, 17 years old. Juanito Soares Jr., 20 years old. Manuel Tan, 18 years old. Cesar Tejones, 23 years old. These are the names of the fellow Filipinos who lost their lives that day in Escalante. Their names are now forever etched on the wall of remembrance at the Bantayog ng mga Bayani. Their deaths are remembered every year in Escalante. They are the Escalante martyrs. The Escalantinos, it would seem, are very intentional in remembering the martyrs. Every 19th of September, a vigil and a torch parade is held to remember that day, the victims and the cause they fought for as well. In the plaza, where a lot of the martyrs died, there is now a monument of 3 raised fists, and the following words are now etched on the monument's marker. Diningdapita sa Septembre 20, 1985, gipatay tungod sa ilang pagbarog alang sa kagawasan, kaangayan ug tinuod nga demokrasya alang sa ilang pamilya ug sa tibuok nasod. Ang mag-ula og dugo alang sa katawhan usa ka kakabayanihon nga dili makalimtan. Ang kinabuhi nga gihalad alang sa pinanggang nasod, bahandianon nga pagtulunan ug dongganon. At this location on the 20th of September 1985, they were killed for standing up for freedom, justice, and true democracy for their families and the whole nation. To shed blood for humanity is a bravery that will never be forgotten. It is a life sacrificed for the love of one's country. full of and rich in lessons and greatness. Thank you so much, LagimFam, for listening to Season 4, Episode 11 of Lagim, a Filipino true crime podcast. And thank you for your patience again when I was taking a very long break. As always, I hope you found this episode valuable and or interesting. If you do, make sure to rate and review my podcast on Apple and Spotify because it helps with making my podcast more visible to others who don't know about it yet. Also, make sure to follow me on all the socials. Check the show notes for all the links to my Insta, Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook accounts. Until next episode, thank you again, LagimFam. Maraming salamat at mabuhay.